HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Tarnished Icons by Stuart M. Kaminsky, read by John Mclain.
Chapter 1. St. Petersburg, Russia, 1862. A woman had been brutally murdered. She was the Baroness Anastasia Volodov-Kronov. The Baroness was a woman of great wealth and social power, who threw an annual celebration with wine, wild fowl, and an assortment of cakes in the park near the new Hermitage. All were invited. The tradition had begun 8 years ago when her husband died. The celebration on the anniversary of the Baron's death was considered to be either a sign of respect for a loyal officer of the Tsar, or a sign of relief that the widow was finally free of an abusive martinet. She had married the Baron when she was a girl of 14, and he an officer of 30. Her death did not sit well with the populace of St. Petersburg in 1862. She was a benefactor, an emulator of the aristocracy of France that had repeatedly rejected her. Her husband was an official hero of his country. Though she lived like a grande dame of Western Europe, holding salons for young artists, she, in quite general but sincere terms, espoused the causes of justice, freedom for all, and an eventual abolition of some of the more unjust practices of the aristocracy. It was said that Tsar Alexander himself had invited the Baroness to all palace parties and looked upon her with favor. In turn, she had prepared a will in which a very valuable gold wolf, the size of a small dog, encrusted with jewels, would be given to the royal family upon her death for inclusion in the growing Hermitage collection. The wolf, a central figure of her former husband's crest, had been commissioned by the late Baron, and was completed, according to the Baron's instructions, by a young French jeweler named Émile Toussaint. Accused of the Baroness's violent murder was a thin young man she had taken under her broad wing, into her ample bosom, and under the silk sheets of her French bed. In addition to her murder, the young man and 3 of his comrades were also accused of taking the gold wolf to sell to a wealthy foreign monarch to support a small group of anti-Tsarist revolutionaries. The young man was 25, one of the new breed who wore long hair, mustaches, and black coats, and uttered proclamations about the rights of serfs. He was the grandson of a Decembrist, one of the officers who had staged a revolt against Tsar Nicholas. His grandfather, Pyotr Marlovov, had returned to St. Petersburg from Siberia 5 years earlier, in 1857, under pardon from the Tsar. The old man had planted in his grandson the seed of revolution. The thin young man and his 3 comrades, 2 of whom were army officers, were shackled together and flanked by a dozen armed soldiers as they marched through Senate Square by the Neva River. The strange-looking little man who was in charge of the armed escort marched next to Marlovov and his comrades. The 2 were a remarkable contrast. Marlovov, in spite of or because of his hard youth in Siberia, stood tall, thin, erect, and handsomely confident, with his hair cut stylishly long in the French manner. If any look dominated his face, it was superiority. Though he had been named Vladimir, he called himself Louis. The little man at his side was another matter altogether. He had great difficulty keeping up with the long-striding prisoner and the brightly uniformed guards. His name was Colonel Dieter Fritzsch, a German in the service of the Tsar. Fritzsch, well dressed in a white uniform, was about 40, fat and clean-shaven. His hair was short, and he had a large round head that was unusually bulbous in the back. His soft, round, snub-nosed face was yellowish in color, as if he had seldom ventured out into the daylight. He wore a perpetual knowing smile as if he kept a secret that he might someday share with you. There was something decidedly feminine about the little man, except for his eyes below white lashes, moist eyes that were quite serious. "If we were to walk a bit slower," said Fritsch with a decidedly German accent, "I would not breathe so heavily, and we could talk." It was summer, and the trees were blocking a view of the Admiralty facade. Louis preened his mustache, shrugged slightly, and glanced down at the ridiculous little man. The other prisoners and the 2 armed guards slowed just a bit. "Thank you," said Fritsch, producing a large handkerchief and mopping his brow. "May we sit briefly?" Louis sighed with annoyance, and looked at his comrades and the guards, one of whom looked at the little German and nodded. The shackled friends strode to a concrete balustrade and sat. The German sat beside Louis. The soldier stood. The leader of the armed escort, a young lieutenant in the red uniform of the royal family's personal guard, said, "10 minutes, Colonel, no more. We'll be in trouble if we don't deliver them for trial on time." The wooden benches would be packed to see the men who had murdered the popular Baroness Volodov Kronov. "You have not confessed to the murder," said Colonel Fritsch, turning his large eyes on the handsome young poet. The other 3 accused looked straight ahead in marble silence. "You have refused to talk to a lawyer. You refuse to admit your guilt. You refuse to proclaim your innocence. You should be easy to convict and hang. Judge Volarov, at his own request, has been assigned to this case. He was a personal friend of the Baroness's. He holds a long-standing grudge against the Decembrists and their survivors. He has no fondness for European dilettantes." "Is that what you take me for?" asked the young man with a sigh. "It is what the judge and jury will take you for," said Fritsch. "And I must confess it is what you appear to be." "You have read my poetry?" asked the young man, crossing his legs. "Some. The thin book published by the Baroness." "And?" asked the young man. "You are more interested in the review of your work by a foreign minister of the Tsar's staff than in possibly saving your life?" "Your assessment of my work?" the young man repeated. "Self-indulgent, mediocre, unoriginal, insincere," said Fritsch. "But what do I know? I'm a soldier, not a critic of poetry." "Went to the theater," the young man said, looking toward the river. "The play was about the Russian fool, Filatka. Laughed a lot. They had a vaudeville show as well, full of amusing verse lampooning lawyers, so outspoken that I wondered how it got past the censor. Civil servants are such swine. You won't catch clods like them going to the theater, not even if they're given free tickets." "Gogol, Diary of a Madman," said Fritsch, recognizing the quotation. "But you left out merchants and newspaper men who criticize everything." The young man looked at the colonel with a new respect. "You do read?" "With slowly growing skill," said Fritsch. "And I send people to prison, into exile, or before a firing squad. Occasionally I help them if they are innocent. Are you innocent of this murder, Vladimir Morlovov?" "I am guilty of the murder," the young man said with little interest. "These 3 others are completely innocent, and I prefer to be called Louis." "More French?" said Colonel Fritsch. 5 more minutes," said the lieutenant. A warm wind blew down the corridor of buildings. One of the 2 soldiers under arrest, a young man with wild hair and in need of a shave, muttered, "We are all equally responsible for what took place." "They mean to kill us," said Marlovov with a shrug. "There is little we can do." The little man stood and began to pace slowly in front of the 4 young men. "The murder happened only 2 days ago," he said, "and you have refused to speak to a policeman or a lawyer." "And soon we will face a jury and judge," said Marlov, "who will convict us in rather short order." Freach wished they were in his curtained office with the big desk. A little intimidation, with time to break down the suspects, would work better than hurried talks in the square, with a third-rate poet, who was decidedly unlikable. Work on them individually. Find a weak one. But the Tsar had personally given Freach his instructions, and there was to be no delay. "Facts," said the little German. "On the morning of July the 3rd, there was a scream in the apartment of the Baroness. It was heard by a maid, who came running into the lady's chamber, where you stood nude over her equally nude body on the bed. In your hand was a knife covered in blood." "Rather damning evidence," admitted Marlov. "And your 3 friends, all members of the nude Decembrist movement, were described by witnesses as leaving the apartments of the Baroness carrying something in a blanket. The famed golden wolf had been removed from its place on the marble pedestal in the bedroom." Marlov sighed. "I was in the washroom undressing and bathing. I had to pay frequent sexual dues to the Baroness in return for her patronage. The Baroness, as you know, was well past 60. She wore too much makeup. When I came out of the washroom, I saw her on the bed, a knife by her side. I realized she must have been murdered while I was bathing. I picked up the knife to protect myself from the killer. Then the maid came in. Your story is ludicrous. If she was dead," said Freach, "how could she have let out the scream that brought the maid rushing in?" The sigh this time was enormous. "It was not she who screamed," said Marlov. "I screamed when I saw the body. Now you may add cowardice to the other traits of which you will accuse me and my friends. Besides, I've confessed to the crime." "How long were you in the washroom?" asked Freach. 10 minutes, perhaps more, as long as I could prolong it and put off my duty to my patroness," said Marlov. "Is there any other way in or out of the bedroom besides through the door the maid entered when she heard the scream?" "A door to the balcony," said the young man, 3 flights up. Another door to the corridor leading to the rear of the apartment, the kitchen." "How many servants were present in the apartment when the murder occurred?" asked Freach. "Surely you must know that." "Humor me." "Just the maid," he said. "Could she have killed the Baroness, gone out to the parlor and rushed back when she heard your scream?" Marlov began to laugh. "I can see her now," he said, "before the judge and jury, a frightened, skinny little dolt, half the size of the cow I bedded. The idea is ridiculous. Do you know who else has apartments in the building where your patroness was murdered?" Again Marlov shrugged. 5 others. Each floor was a complete suite. I knew none of the other tenants except to exchange nods. I didn't wish to. Anastasia did not wish me to." "Odd," said Freach, rubbing his forehead. "I would have thought that since she had paid for you, she would want to show you off to everyone." "We had readings in her parlor. Her friends attended." "But none of her neighbors?" Louis shrugged again. "Who knows? They were all much the same, eating what they could get, drinking what they could reach." "So," said Freach, "who murdered the Baroness and who took the golden wolf?" "Who knows?" said Louis. "We are all to be shot for it. I repeat, you have my confession." "You can save the lives of your friends," said Freach. "I am empowered to grant them immediate exile to Siberia if you turn over the wolf. Only you will be tried." "And shot," said Marlov. Freach looked at all 4 of the young men. The 4 men looked at one another, and in their look was an agreement. They would die together. Freach understood. These young men would die for a losing cause. The German was equally willing to die. He had sold his loyalty to the Russian monarch, and the sale was final, and he would honor it. The only difference between himself and the quartet of revolutionaries was the object of their loyalty. Marlov now stood. He towered over the little man. The guards flanked the young men and began to lead them off in the direction of the court. Fritzsch did not join them. He did not move till they were out of sight, though he could still hear the distant rattling of their chains. He patted real and imaginary wrinkles in his uniform, adjusted his cap, and made his way to the chambers of General Androyanov. A tall young officer disappeared through a door and returned within a minute to usher Fritzsch into the large office. The tall man departed, closing the door behind him. The general's chamber was a large office, much larger than Fritzsch's office across the river. The general was a tall, robust, imposing man in his 60s. He had pure white flowing hair. He stood at a mirror in the massive office adjusting his uniform. Androyanov was known to be a personal friend of the Tsar himself. Satisfied with his appearance, the general turned to face the perspiring German. Fritzsch stood at rigid attention. "I can see from your face that you have failed," said the general in French. "They are true believers," answered Fritzsch in French. "Torture? We would take their dignity, but would not obtain the wolf," said Fritzsch. The general nodded. He had come to accept the perceptions and talents of the German. He turned in his chair and looked out of his windows at the 3-story yellow Menshikov Palace, directly across the river from the Senate. The modest palace had been built by Alexander Menshikov, who rose from being a stable boy to become the best friend of Peter the Great, and eventually the second most powerful man in all of Russia. The building was constructed in 1710, the first stone palace in a city of cathedrals and palaces. "Do you know why I like this view?" the general said, actually pointing to the window. "It is a historic and beautiful landmark," said Fritzsch. "I was a stable boy, like Menshikov," said the general. "Did you know that?" "Yes, I know that. Your service to the Tsar, your many accomplishments are well known." The general adjusted his collar. Folding his large hands on his massive desk, he looked up at Fritzsch. "The wolf is lost," he said. Fritzsch nodded. "I shall tell the Tsar," the general said, still in French, "and assure him that we will not rest until it is recovered, and any others involved in this revolutionary pimple of a movement are squeezed until blood flows. Time will pass. We will fail. There are many in court who will be pleased at our failure, Colonel, because I am the only general in the Tsar's army who is not of noble birth. But I shall not fail. You understand?" "Fully," said Fritzsch. "A baroness is dead. 4 men will be shot. Others will probably follow. You and I will battle to retain our positions, influence and dignity, and the Tsar shall suffer yet another disappointment. Colonel, have you ever seen the Golden Wolf?" "Never," said Fritzsch, knowing the white collar of his uniform was turning dark from perspiration. "Pity," he said. "It is truly magnificent." In the distance, outside the window, a volley of shots crackled. Neither man moved. "Brief trial and swift justice," said the general. He stood with a sigh. In Russian, he said, "Let's bring the bad news to the Tsar." Chapter 2. Moscow, Russia, 1996. Katerina Ivanova hurried along the snow-covered Taras-Shevchenko embankment by the Moscow River. When she had finished her shift as an elevator operator in the Ukrainia Hotel, it had been just before midnight, which gave her half an hour to rush down the embankment, go under the Bordino Bridge, hurry through the garden in front of the Kiev railway station, and get to the Kievskaya metro station. If she missed the last metro, she would either have to take a cab, which she could not afford, or go back to the hotel and ask Mclain to help her sneak into an empty room for the night. Katrina did not want to ask Mclain's help. She did not want to ask anyone's help. She had, in her 32 years, been less than pleased with the help offered to her by almost all men and most women. There was always a price to pay. It was December, and a light snow was falling on 2 days of old snow blown about by a bitter wind off the river. Katrina did not mind the cold or the snow. The colder it was, the less likely she was to be bothered by a drunk or a mugger, or one of the new gangs of children who robbed, raped, and murdered. At this hour and in this weather, she was unlikely to be disturbed. A voice, an almost animal wail, rose in the wind in front of her. Katrina's left foot struck a patch of ice under a thin spot of snow. She almost slipped, but held her balance and managed to keep from falling. Katrina was bundled tight in a lined cloth coat over a wool sweater with a high neck. A wool hat was pulled and tied to cover her ears and pink cheeks. Katrina Ivanova knew she was no beauty, but she was certainly not ugly. Her body was straight and solid if a bit heavy, and her skin was pink and clear. Her hair was as blonde as it had been on her 3rd birthday. There was another sound ahead of her in the near darkness. This too was a voice, a deeper voice, wailing in the wind. Someone was ahead of her, along the embankment, out of sight to her left. She would not be able to avoid it. Maybe it was just the rustling of wind and snow in the trees, or a stray dog, or even 2 men arguing on the bridge still far ahead, their voices carrying far in the night. The incidence of attacks on women had, since the end of the Soviet Union, risen so dramatically that the statistics published in the newspapers and given on television were no longer reliable. Rapes and murders were up 200 or 300%. Gangs slaughtered one another on the street. Criminals, with guns visible under their jackets, were welcomed into the best hotels, including the Ukrainia. Katrina was good at statistics. She loved statistics. There was certainty in them. Before her, through the haze of white, she could see the lights of Bolshaya Dorogomilovskaya Street, where the bridge crossed into the heart of the city. She stood silently for an instant. No more voices in the wind ahead of her. Another 50 yards to go. No one in sight. The street lamps along the embankment were on, though they were dimmed by the swirl of snow. She could hurry and risk falling, or she could go a bit slower. Katrina chose to hurry. Suddenly in front of her, through the whoosh of a gust of wind, she heard 4 sharp, loud cracks, like a steel cable striking a metal beam. Now she was sure. There was a moan, and then 3, 4 more loud cracks just ahead. Katrina was frightened. There was no doubting that now, no lying to herself. About 25 yards ahead of her, a hunched creature suddenly came up from the riverside. It looked like a bear. The creature looked around and saw Katrina. Katrina, seeing something glitter in the creature's hand, reached into her heavy red plastic purse and pulled out a Tokarev 7.62mm automatic. She had purchased it from a waiter in the hotel kitchen almost a year before, when she had realized that the new Russia was a place of madness where statistics might be meaningless. The bear-like figure began to raise its right arm, and Katrina could see that there was something in its hand. She dropped her purse gently in the snow, gripped the pistol in her wool-gloved hands, and leveled the weapon at the hulk pointing at her. She fired first, and the creature stood straight up. It was a man in a long coat and fur cap, and he definitely had a weapon in his hand. He staggered back, surprised at the shot, hit by a bullet. Then he fired. Katrina felt a sudden squeezing of her left arm, as if some great gorilla had grasped her in anger. Before she could fire again, the man ran in the direction of the bridge. Actually, it was more like an animal lope than a run, a strange lope that even at this moment seemed odd. Then he was gone, into the darkness. She could hear him moving farther and farther away. Her arm hurt, and she was frightened. She picked up her red purse and hurried toward the bridge, screaming for help. She hoped someone would hear her and come to help her, though she knew that few would be brave enough to respond to the midnight cries of a woman so far from the busy, lighted streets. Katrina felt dizzy. Weapon still in her hand, she moved forward. She tried not to look down as she shuffled, but she could not resist, and knew she was bleeding. She could see the dark drops falling onto the snow in front of her, and she looked back to see their dim trail behind her. Katrina was lost in weeping panic as she hurried forward. The footsteps in the snow, where the man who shot her had come up from the embankment, lured her toward the edge of the drop to the river. Lights from the other side of the river reflected off the water, bobbing jigsaw pieces, and she saw them, about 10 feet down. There were 4 figures laid out in a line, almost perfectly straight, as if they had arranged themselves and were about to make identical snow angels. But these figures did not move. The light wasn't good enough to see clearly, but Katrina knew. In her heart, she knew that the 4 were dead, murdered by the creature who had shot her. She trudged forward, too weak and frightened now to scream. He would leap out. She knew it. From behind a clump of snow-covered bushes or a stone block that marked the drop to the river. Something moved ahead. She fired again, not trying to hit anything, but trying to keep the creature at bay. A dog scuttled out from behind a stand of birch trees and fled in fear into the narrow parkway away from the river. Katrina reached the street. She saw the frightened faces of 3 bundled old men. She passed out. When she opened her eyes, a broad, flat face appeared before her. She tried to bring it into focus. For an instant, she thought it might be the man from the river, but something about the concern in his eyes and the warm feeling of a white room calmed her. "We're in the hospital," the man said gently. "You have lost some blood, but you will recover. Agda is being brought here in a police car. We found her name in your purse." Katrina nodded, her mouth painfully dry. "Water?" she whispered. The burly man poured a glass of water from a pitcher next to her bed. "Just a sip or 2, said the man. She nodded and did as she was told. The man appeared to be in his 50s. He had dark hair just beginning to turn gray, and the body of a small delivery truck. Under his coat he wore a yellow turtleneck sweater that gave him the appearance of having no neck at all. "My name is Chief Inspector Porfiry Rostnikov," the man said. "My colleague is Inspector Timofyeva." Katrina turned her eyes, but not her head, to a second figure in the room, a young, pretty blonde woman, definitely on the solid side. The young woman was wearing an open dark coat and a long red scarf. She could have been mistaken for Katrina's younger sister. "We are with the Office of Special Investigation, Petrovka," the man said. "Can you talk?" "Yes," she said dryly. She took another small sip of water. "Will I be able to use my arm again?" "Yes," said the young woman. She stepped to the edge of the bed and touched Katrina's right arm gently. "The wound is not bad. What happened?" Katrina told her story. The young woman took notes, and the man stood, hands in his pockets, listening. When Katrina finished, the man said, "You did not recognize the..."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?